Today's video is sponsored by Private Internet Access VPN. Picture your home with every window wide open and a neon sign that says, "Come look inside." That's what surfing without a VPN looks like. Private Internet Access VPN shuts the curtains and locks the doors. It hides and encrypts your IP address, so hackers, advertisers, and even your own internet service providers stay outside in the dark. Privacy is only half the story. Geo-blocks vanish too. If a show, match, or game store tells you that it isn't available where you live, hop to one of Private Internet Access's servers in any of 91 countries, including all 50 United States, and watch or shop as a local. Changing regions can even knock serious cash off flights and hotel rates. Private Internet Access also has a strict no-logs policy, audited and tested in court, meaning your data is never stored or sold. One subscription shields unlimited devices, including Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, iOS, and more. Right now, head to piavpn.com/Savox for 83% off, coming in at a grand total of just $2 a month, and get 4 extra months for free. It's also risk-free thanks to a 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's piavpn.com/Savox. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Huge thanks for Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Doctors are meant to be the people we look to for help when we're sick, and it's generally their job to help us. At least it used to be. These days in the UK, you'll be lucky to get an appointment within 6 months, even if you're literally sat there bleeding out in the waiting room. Regardless, doctors are at least supposed to do good, and you saw the title of this video. These ones are just monsters who got the title of doctor. By the way, this iceberg was made by me for a change. This is the evil doctor's iceberg. Christopher Daniel Dunch, born in 1971, carried an MD-PhD resume that dazzled Dallas recruiters in 2011. Baylor Plano granted him full spinal surgery privileges, despite whispers from his training program about skipped labs, late-night cocaine binges, and barely 200 log cases, 1/5 of a normal workload. Soon after he scrubbed in, routine operations unraveled into carnage. During a single cervical fusion, he sliced an artery and left teacher Kelly Martin dying under the lights. A month later, he drilled straight through Floella Brown's vertebral artery and watched her have a stroke on the table. The pattern escalated. Christopher's own childhood friend Jerry Summers emerged quadriplegic after surgery. Jeff Glidwell awoke with a severed esophagus and a blood-soaked sponge still inside his neck. Screws meant to anchor Mary Eford's spine wound up in muscle and soft tissue, stealing her mobility and most of her blood. 33 of 38 patients were left maimed or dead, yet every hospital that fired him let him walk out with a clean reference, allowing the next disaster to begin. Surgeons Robert Henderson and Randall Kirby finally assembled operative records, imaging, and a chilling email in which Dunch bragged he was, quote, "ready to become a cold-blooded killer," then took the bundle to prosecutors. The Texas Medical Board pulled his license in December 2013. A Dallas grand jury indicted him in July 2015 on 5 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and 1 of injuring an elderly patient. The case focused on Eford's shattered back. After 4 hours of deliberation, jurors convicted him, and on February 20th, 2017, he received life in prison, the first American surgeon in prison for acts committed entirely inside the operating room. Dunch now spends his days in the Ellis unit, while his victims had to relearn how to move, breathe, or swallow 1 painstaking inch at a time. Farid Tanios Fatah, born in Lebanon in 1965, completed residency at Maimonides Medical Center and a fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering before moving to Michigan to practice oncology. He opened Michigan Hematology Oncology in Rochester Hills in 2003 and spun it into 7 plush clinics that promoted an aggressive, quote, European protocol of chemotherapy. Recruiters and nurses who toured the infusion rooms saw hour-long drips ordered where 15 minutes was standard and filed complaints that state regulators shelved. By 2009, the enterprise housed its own lab, pharmacy, and radiation suite, drawing thousands of patients and keeping every billable service in-house. Federal agents later tallied at least 553 people who received toxic drugs that they did not need, while Medicare alone paid roughly $34 million on his claims. An early morning raid on August 6, 2013 ended the scheme, and a superseded indictment 1 month later accused him of healthcare fraud, kickbacks, money laundering, and even naturalization fraud tied to the cover-up. In September 2014, he pled guilty to 13 fraud counts, 1 kickback conspiracy, 2 laundering counts, admitting he had floated up to $225 million in false claims. At sentencing in July 2015, former patients shuffled in on canes and called him, quote, a monster and master of deceit, describing brittle bones, organ damage, and ruined finances. Judge Paul Borman labeled the case, quote, heinous and sadistically cruel, and handed down 45 years, a virtual life term, far above the defense plea for 25. Prosecutors revealed one man endured 155 chemo sessions while cancer-free. Others were dosed while unconscious or terminal solely to keep payments flowing. A court-run fund later began paying limited restitution, approving millions for funeral bills and corrective care, but nothing for pain or lost wages. Fatah now sits in FCI Williamsburg, not eligible for release until 2050, while the tissue he poisoned in more than 500 victims continues to heal or scar. Paolo Macchiarani was born in Switzerland in 1958 and trained in thoracic surgery in Pisa and Hanover before building a reputation in Barcelona for tissue-engineered airways. In 2010, Stockholm's Karolinska Institute hired him as a visiting professor and surgeon, granting laboratory space and operating privileges. Between June 2011 and 2012, he slid 3 plastic windpipes seeded with each patient's stem cells into deliberately ill recipients and published the first operation in The Lancet to worldwide applause. The implants fragmented and leaked. Anna Marian Bieni, Christopher Lyles, and Yulia Tulik died within months, while others battled chronic infections and bleeding fistulas. Surgeons who assisted him later said charts had been rewritten to mask complications, and in 2014, 4 whistleblowers filed misconduct charges, accusing him of falsifying 7 papers. Swedish television's 3-part documentary, The Experiment, broadcast in January 2016, propelled the scandal nationwide and triggered resignations across Karolinska's leadership. Karolinska dismissed him in March 2016, while Nature and The Guardian reported that at least 6 of the 8 people given synthetic tracheas had already died, and the survivors were gravely ill. Though Swedish regulators halted his license, he kept operating in Russia on patients whose conditions were not immediately life-threatening. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated assault. On June 21, 2023, the Svea Court of Appeal convicted him of gross assault in 3 cases and handed him a 2.5-year prison term. Judges ruled that he had foreseen the likelihood of serious injury, yet operated with indifference, establishing criminal intent. By 2025, he remained incarcerated, his key papers retracted, his resume littered with fabricated honors, including a phantom Vatican wedding exposed by Vanity Fair, while fragments of collapsed windpipes and autopsy photos testified to the lives his self-promotion destroyed. Conrad Robert Murray was born in 1953 in Grenada. He moved to Houston in 1980, finished a pre-med degree at Texas Southern University in 3 years, earned his MD at Mary Medical College, and completed cardiology training in Arizona. By the late 1990s, he ran concierge heart clinics in Las Vegas and Houston, treating casino high rollers and celebrities, yet he carried heavy debts, unpaid child support orders, and defaulted loans that kept his finances precarious. The $150,000 a month offer to serve as Michael Jackson's personal physician for his planned This Is It tour in summer 2009 looked like a rescue, so he moved into Jackson's Holmby Hills mansion and went on the payroll. Jackson complained of crippling insomnia. Murray ordered 255 vials of hospital-grade propofol and midazolam, having them shipped to a girlfriend's apartment rather than a clinic. Night after night, he dripped the anesthetic through an IV without monitors, a crash cart, or written charts, breaking off to talk on the phone while the drug flowed. Just after noon, on June 25, 2009, he discovered Jackson not breathing, tried one-handed CPR on a soft mattress, and waited roughly 21 minutes before anyone called 911. The coroner later ruled the death a homicide caused by acute propofol intoxication, worsened by benzodiazepines. The televised trial that opened on September 27, 2011, showcased pharmacy receipts missing records, and phone logs. Jurors convicted him of involuntary manslaughter on November 7, 2011. Judge Michael Pastor branded his conduct reckless and imposed the maximum 4-year sentence. Thanks to California's overcrowding credits, he walked out of Men's Central Jail on October 28, 2013, after serving just under 2 years. Texas revoked his license in August 2013, and boards in California and Nevada soon followed, citing gross negligence and record-keeping failures. As of 2025, he is still battling to overturn those bans in civil court, promoting a memoir that claimed he alone knew the truth of Jackson's last hours. James Caird Bird was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1921 and earned his MD at the University of Rochester in 1945, before returning home to practice obstetrics and gynecology. By the mid-1960s, while on staff at Riverside Hospital, he claimed that women were, quote, structurally inadequate for intercourse, and began quietly reshaping their genitalia during routine childbirth repairs without telling them. In a 1975 Vanity Press book, Surgery of Love, he promised to create, quote, horny little mice through clitoral circumcision, labial reduction, and a rotated vaginal canal, a blueprint he insisted would guarantee effortless orgasms. Late-night radio spots and newspaper interviews soon billed him as, quote, the love surgeon, drawing patients from across the Midwest who believed they were signing up for cutting-edge sexual medicine. Inside the operating room, he often added the procedure while a woman was still sedated for an episiotomy or a prolapse repair, leaving no chance for informed consent. Hospital paperwork later showed he had performed at least 4,500 of the operations by 1977, and perhaps more than 9,000 before anyone outside of Dayton intervened. Victims reported infections, fistulas, chronic pain, and sexual dysfunction. One consulting surgeon said a patient's vulva looked, quote, like a filleted fish. National coverage in late 1988 spurred more than 40 women to lodge formal charges with the Ohio Medical Board, accusing Bird of sexual mutilation and fraud. Facing a hearing on 41 counts, Bird surrendered his license on January 25, 1989, and agreed never again to practice medicine in the United States. Over 160 women sued. Insurers ultimately paid settlements that topped $21 million, wiping out his assets and forcing him into bankruptcy. He spent his final years on a small horse farm outside Dayton and died on July 10, 2012, at the age of 90. Michael Rosen, that's Rosen, not Michael Rosen, for those just listening to the video not actually looking at it. Michael Rosen started practicing dermatology in Sarasota in 1978, and by 1983, owned a clinic and lab where he presented himself as one of the area's rare specialists in Mohs myographic surgery, a meticulous layer-by-layer skin cancer technique. He cultivated a sterling reputation, but internal records later revealed a scheme that targeted frightened retirees for profit. Nearly every patient he saw left with a, quote, aggressive cancer diagnosis, and he billed Medicare for the maximum 4 stages of cutting on virtually 100% of his cases, 10 times the normal rate. When a slide showed no tumor, staff said he sometimes swapped it for fragments of bubblegum or styrofoam so it would appear malignant under the microscope, then booked surgery for the next morning. Victims walked out with cratered noses, ears, and eyelids, while Medicare reimbursements topped $3 million. In 2004, a longtime patient joined Rosen's office manager in a whistleblower suit that brought federal agents through the door. The Florida Department of Health barred him from surgery for the next year, labeling his conduct egregious and an immediate public danger. A grand jury soon returned 70 counts, 35 for healthcare fraud and 35 for false statements, and after a 17-day trial in March 2006, jurors convicted him on every charge. The judge sentenced Rosen in October 2006 to 22 years in federal prison, ordered $3.7 million in restitution and forfeiture, and ruled that his fraud caused serious bodily injury. Court testimony counted at least 864 seniors who had been carved up without medical need. Larry Nassar grew up in Michigan, and by the mid-1990s, he had secured dual posts that gave him near unfettered access to young athletes: staff physician at Michigan State University's Sports Medicine Clinic, and medical coordinator for the U.S. Women's National Gymnastics team, a role he held from 1996 through 2014. He styled himself as a benevolent athletic trainer who could ease chronic pain, yet his signature treatment involved penetrating examinations performed without gloves or chaperones. Acts he told parents were advanced osteopathic techniques, but that survivors later described as thinly veiled molestation. For years, complaints drifted around Michigan State and USA Gymnastics, only to stall in campus offices or vanish into private folders, until reporters at the Indianapolis Star published allegations in September 2016. Rachel Denhollander's on-record testimony opened the floodgates. Within weeks, federal agents uncovered more than 37,000 images of children on Nassar's discarded hard drives, leading to a July 2017 guilty plea on explicit material charges and a 60-year federal sentence that ensured he would never leave prison alive. State prosecutors followed with first-degree criminal sexual conduct counts spanning 2 Michigan counties. In January 2018, the judge listened as 156 women, including Olympians, college gymnasts, and former club athletes, stood in court and detailed how a trusted doctor had violated them as children. The judge imposed a maximum term of 40 to 175 years, calling his federal time a mere starting point, and a second judge added 40 to 125 years weeks later, with the sentences to run consecutively. By the time investigators had tallied at least 265 known victims, many first touched during what should have been routine sports injury visits, and Michigan State agreed to pay $500 million to settle civil suits that alleged administrators ignored warning after warning. Even behind bars, the case kept expanding. Time magazine revealed that the USA Gymnastics had paid Michaela Maroney to stay silent, while Reuters reported that Nassar was stabbed by another inmate in 2023, surviving yet another reckoning he could not control. The once celebrated physician is now serving what amounts to consecutive life terms. Richard Strauss earned his medical degree at the University of Chicago in 1964, served a stint as a Navy lieutenant, and drifted through research posts at Penn, Hawaii, and Harvard before Ohio State hired him as an assistant professor and a volunteer team doctor in 1978. By 1981, he held an official slot inside the athletics department, where wrestlers, swimmers, and fencers endured routine exams that lingered on their genitals while staff whispered about the odd-looking procedures as early as 1979. Complaints stacked up for nearly 2 decades, yet administrators only pulled him from student clinics in January 1996, and even then they let him keep his tenure and emeritus perks. Strauss simply opened a private men's clinic off campus and continued the same hands-on, quote, treatments, according to survivors, who said the doctor rubbed, fondled, and inspected until he was satisfied. A 2019 Perkins Cole investigation confirmed he had abused at least 177 male students from 1979 through 1998, spanning 16 varsity sports, while campus crime data later logged more than 2,800 separate acts and over 170 rapes attributed to him. Former athletes recalled how he showered beside them, then groped during injury checks until some said they tried to hide minor sprains rather than face him. The scandal spilled into politics when ex-assistant wrestling coach and future Congressman Jim Jordan was accused of ignoring locker room warnings, allegations he flatly denied on camera in 2023. Strauss never stood trial. He parked in a Los Angeles garage in August 2005 and ended his life by carbon monoxide poisoning at 67. Ohio State has since paid more than $60 million to about 300 survivors and acknowledged still pending suits by hundreds more. After earning his MD at the University of Rochester, George Reardon joined St. Francis Hospital in 1963 as a junior endocrinologist. He soon became chief of the department and the hospital's public face for children's growth disorders. Behind that prestige, he operated a so-called, quote, human growth study, inviting neighborhood children into a windowless exam room lined with lights, a camera, and a narrow bed, where he would photograph them and commit other indecent acts. A 1970 letter from the Hartford County Medical Association cautioned him to keep a chaperone after parents complained about invasive exams, yet he ignored the warning and expanded the project through the 1970s and 1980s. Survivors later told NBC cameras that the doctor committed various abusive acts towards them, sometimes summoning the same child dozens of times a year. Hospital officials finally forced his resignation in 1993. The state pulled his license in 1995, and he died of a heart attack 3 years later, without ever facing charges. In May 2007, a new owner renovating Reardon's former West Hartford home smashed through a false basement wall and found about 50,000 slides and more than 100 reels of explicit material involving children. Police counted at least 500 distinct victims and had positively identified about 250 by 2011. That same year, St. Francis paid an undisclosed settlement to 32 plaintiffs, while more than 90 additional suits waited on the docket. Court filings accused Reardon of more than 2,800 separate assaults, stretching from 1963 to 1993, framing him as one of the most prolific child predators ever associated with an American hospital. Miles Bradbury, a 41-year-old paediatric haematologist from Herringswell, Suffolk, joined Aidan Brooks Hospital in Cambridge in 2008 as the new consultant for childhood blood cancers. Parents of gravely ill children saw him as the gentle face of the ward, while he quietly manipulated chaperone rules to get the boys alone. From late 2008 until his suspension in November 2013, he abused at least 18 patients aged 8 to 16, lingering over, quote, examinations behind a curtain even when mothers or fathers stood on the other side. He coerced some to perform in front of him so he could, quote, monitor development, and demanded them to remove their clothes without medical cause. Using a covert pen camera that looked like a stethoscope, he captured roughly 170,000 still images and stored more than 16,000 indecent files on hard drives seized from his home. Detectives picked up his trail when Canadian police probing Operation Spade traced a CP DVD to his address, leading to his December 2013 arrest and immediate suspension by the trust. He pleaded guilty in September 2014 to 25 counts of assault, voyeurism, and creating indecent images, and investigators contacted about 800 families whose children had passed through his clinics. At sentencing on December 1, 2014, the judge called the case one of the worst he had encountered and imposed a 22-year prison term at Cambridge Crown Court. The Court of Appeal cut the total to 16 years in 2015, but he kept the extended license period and lifelong sex offender registration. By 2017, civil actions had secured damages running into millions for survivors, some of whom had died from the cancers Bradbury had once pretended to treat. A later independent review listed red flags staff had missed, from appointments arranged on his personal phone to a ban on medical students observing his exams. Every archived photograph, curtain cubicle, and apology letter now marked how a trusted pediatric doctor weaponized disease and dignity to feed his private collection. Reginald McGregor Archibald was born in New York in 1910 and earned a string of chemistry and medical degrees in Canada before winning a research fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute in Manhattan in 1943. By 1948, he had opened a pediatric endocrinology clinic there, and over the next 34 years, he became the country's go-to short-stature doctor, running thousands of so-called growth studies until his retirement in 1982. He also volunteered as a physician in residence at the Madison Square Boys Club, using annual physicals to steer club members into his Rockefeller program and onto his private exam list. Inside a windowless room, he ordered children to remove their clothes and proceeded to perform multiple indecent acts on them, all the while recording the acts as puberty data. Survivors said he called them back year after year from as young as 6, their visits logged as routine follow-ups in hospital files. Archibald hoarded tens of thousands of slides, films, and even bodily fluid samples, material investigators never fully located. Rockefeller finally sent warning letters to more than 1,000 former patients in October 2018 and hired Debevoise and Plimpton, whose 2019 report found administrators had received credible complaints as early as 1960 and confirmed widespread abuse spanning 4 decades. Lawyers now estimated he assaulted at least 1,000 children. One civil filing suggested over 2,000, and suits under New York's Child Victims Act continue against the university, the Boys Club, and Archibald's estate. Reginald Archibald died in 2007, but hundreds of crimes and multi-million-dollar settlements keep surfacing. William Hamilton Ayers, a Yale-trained child psychiatrist born in 1932, settled in San Mateo County in the early 1960s and even hosted local public television sex education segments, credentials that made parents and juvenile court judges eager to send troubled boys to his private office. His prestige peaked when colleagues elected him president of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry from 1993 to 1995, a line on his resume that helped funnel hundreds of patients through a soundproof examination room in Redwood City. Behind the closed door, he ordered boys to undress and submitted them to prolonged, quote, exams, where he would perform a number of inappropriate acts while pretending to gather clinical data. Whispers stretched back to 1966, but the first investigation with teeth began in 2002 after a civil lawsuit prompted police to reopen an earlier complaint. Detectives ultimately tallied more than 40 potential victims. Constrained by the statutes of limitations, prosecutors focused on assaults committed between 1991 and 1996 against boys aged 9 to 13. Ayers was arrested at his home on April 6, 2007, and pleaded not guilty to 21 felony counts, insisting the children had misread legitimate medical practice. A 2009 jury deadlocked, but facing a second trial in May 2013, he switched to a no-contest plea on 8 counts of lewd and lascivious acts. In August 2013, the judge sentenced the 81-year-old to state prison and ordered lifetime sex offender registration, while adult survivors described decades of fallout. Ayers spent most of his term in a prison medical facility, citing dementia, and died of natural causes on April 20, 2016, at the California Medical Facility, aged 84. By then, investigators had logged 45 additional men whose cases could not be prosecuted, and civil attorneys argued that hundreds more counseling sessions had blurred into abuse. Records showed he had also evaluated offenders for the same juvenile court that routed boys to him, weaving his predation into the justice system's intake process. For years, he tried to postpone accountability by claiming worsening dementia. A 2011 competency hearing even ended in a mistrial before doctors declared him fit to face the charges that finally sealed his fate. James Marion Sims was born in South Carolina in 1813 and earned his medical degree in Philadelphia before setting up practice in Montgomery, Alabama. By the mid-1840s, he became obsessed with repairing vesicovaginal fistulas, tear-like openings that cause constant incontinence after difficult childbirths. Wealthy plantation owners allowed him to use the enslaved women who suffered the injury. He purchased some outright so he could keep them near his backyard hospital. Between 1845 and 1849, he operated on at least 11 enslaved patients, most famously Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. Anarcha endured roughly 30 procedures. Sims used a bent pewter spoon as the first modern vaginal speculum and worked with crude sutures of silver wire, reopening the wounds again and again when they failed. Ether became available in American surgery in 1846, but he continued to restrain the women and operate without anesthesia, arguing that black patients supposedly felt pain differently, an idea he never tested on white volunteers. In the same period, Sims treated enslaved infants suffering from neonatal tetanus. I can't go into detail about exactly what he did to these babies. All I can say is it involved operating on their skulls. He carried out these operations until the mortality rate dropped, though many babies died during this learning curve. After moving to New York City in 1853, Sims opened the first women's hospital in America, perfected his technique on Irish immigrant charity cases, and marketed himself internationally as, quote, the father of gynecology. Despite his horrible actions, he was indeed considered a pioneer in the field, and there was even a statue of him in New York Central Park until 2018. He never faced any kind of repercussions for his actions during life, and died of a heart attack on November 13, 1883. Walter Jackson Freeman II was born in Philadelphia in 1895, the grandson of a famed Civil War surgeon. After Yale and a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, he drifted into psychiatry, frustrated by how little it could offer the severely mentally ill. In 1936, he read about the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz drilling holes in skulls to sever frontal lobe connections and decided the United States needed the operation at scale. Lacking surgical training, he recruited Georgetown neurosurgeon James Watts and began opening foreheads in a Washington, D.C. asylum, reporting immediate, quote, calming even when patients slid into apathy. Freeman wanted something faster. In 1946, he slid a modified ice pick from his kitchen toolkit under a patient's eyelid, tapped it through the thin orbital bone with a hammer, and swept the blade side to side to scramble white matter fibers, all in 10 minutes, often outside an operating room. Instead of anesthesia, he used an electroconvulsive jolt to knock patients unconscious, then posed for photographs beside the still twitching bodies. He called the move the transorbital lobotomy. Newspapers called him a miracle worker. Freeman bought a camper van he nicknamed, quote, the Lobotomobile, and even drove state to state, pitching state hospitals on speed and savings. By the mid-1950s, he had performed or supervised roughly 3,500 lobotomies, including children as young as 4. Mortality hovered near 5%. Countless survivors emerged incontinent, mute, or childlike. Even as antipsychotic drugs arrived, he kept sharpening picks, performing double lobotomies with both hands at once for onlookers. In 1967, a third attempt on longtime patient Helen Mortensen caused a fatal brain hemorrhage, and California revoked his license. Freeman spent his final years retracing old routes, taking Polaroids of the people he had broken. Chester Milton Southam, born in Ontario in 1919, graduated from Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons in 1947 and moved straight into cancer research at Memorial Sloan Kettering. By the early 1950s, he fixated on a blunt question: would a healthy immune system reject living cancer cells if they were seeded directly under the skin? He started inside the Ohio State Penitentiary, lining up volunteers with life sentences and sliding syringes filled with freshly harvested HeLa cells into their forearms. Hot, small nodules blossomed within days. When they did not recede fast enough, he cut them off himself, noting who scarred and who kept growing tumors. The work soon expanded. Records later suggested he used well over 300 prisoners during the stretch. In 1963, Southern carried the same syringes into Brooklyn's Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital and injected 22 senile bedridden patients without telling them the fluid contained aggressive cancer cells. He wrote "skin test" on every chart and assured skeptical nurses the Wortley plagues were harmless. 3 young doctors blew the whistle. A Regents hearing in 1966 found Southam guilty of fraud and unprofessional conduct and left his license dangling on a 1-year probation. He kept the title of Chief of Virology, accepted the presidency of the American Association for Cancer Research in 1969, and never apologized to the men and women whose bodies he treated as disposable incubators. Leo Leonidas Stanley was born in 1886 in rural Oregon, finished medical school in San Francisco, and landed the post of chief surgeon in San Quentin in 1913, even though he had never performed a major operation. He preached eugenics from day one, claimed bad glands caused crime, and lobbied to sterilize anyone he deemed unfit. When California law capped compulsory procedures, he hung posters in the yard persuading inmates to, quote, volunteer, ultimately logging about 600 vasectomies and thyroid removals, while boasting that the surgery would boost virility and curb disease. Stanley's darker obsession was gland rejuvenation. Between 1918 and the early 1940s, he carved testicles from freshly executed men, or, failing that, goats, boars, rams, and deer, then sewed them into other prisoners, or ground the tissue into a slurry and injected it straight into their abdomens. He treated senility, depression, asthma, and even pedophilia with this quick fix, keeping meticulous notes on who grew hair, who grew tumors, and who simply died. By his own tally, he performed more than 10,000 of these procedures and sketched plans to expand the work nationwide. A 1928 mutilation lawsuit over an executed inmate's missing organs briefly exposed his program, but the case fizzled and he kept operating until his retirement in 1951. He lived to 90, unapologetic, convinced he had been curing criminals one stolen gland at a time. Loretta Bender was born in Butte, Montana in 1897, earned her MD at the University of Iowa, and rose to head the children's ward at Bellevue Hospital in 1934. She framed autism and childhood psychosis as organic brain disease and decided the cure had to be physical. Beginning in the early 1940s, she strapped children as young as 3 to gurneys and ran electroconvulsive current through their skulls every morning for 20-day stretches. Hospital logs showed more than 500 shocks by the mid-1950s. She noted improved behavior, even when the children left mute, incontinent, or shaking with fresh seizures. After moving to Creedmoor State Hospital in Queens, she doubled down. In 1961, she dosed nearly 100 autistic children with daily hits of LSD, sometimes for months, claiming the hallucinations might jumpstart stalled development. Side effects range from raging panic to complete withdrawal, but she recorded the trials as success and kept the vials coming. She also tried insulin coma therapy and heavy thorazine sedation, insisting aggressive treatment was better than leaving lost souls to drift. Her papers praised the experiments. The children who survived them were never asked what they thought. Donald Ewan Cameron was born in Bridge of Allan, Scotland in 1901, trained in psychiatry at Glasgow and the Menager Clinic, then took charge of the brand new Allan Memorial Institute at McGill in 1943. He fixated on the idea that mental illness could be erased if the mind was first wiped clean, so he cranked electroconvulsive pulses far beyond standard doses, kept patients in drug-induced sleep for weeks, and hammered them with barbiturates until they could no longer recall their names. By 1957, he had a new phase he called psychic driving. After the shocks, he locked patients into sensory-deprived rooms and piped repetitive taped messages, sometimes their own voices, sometimes his, through helmet-light speakers for up to 16 hours a day, hoping to etch fresh personalities onto the blank slates. Money for the project flowed quietly from the CIA's MKUltra budget through a front charity labeled the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Most of the 100-plus subjects had come seeking help for depression or postpartum anxiety. Many left incontinent, amnesic, and unable to recognize family. Cameron stepped down in 1964, collected honors as past president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations, and died 3 years later, never meeting the patients who later testified that his cure had stolen their lives. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in 1946 in Nottingham, the second child of devout Methodist parents who pushed him toward medicine from an early age. He formed an intense bond with his mother Vera, and as he watched a visiting doctor ease her final weeks of lung cancer with morphine in June 1963, he saw how a needle could quiet a struggling body. He passed through Leeds School of Medicine in 1970, married Primrose Oxtoby at 20, and seemed to embody the respectable young family doctor. That facade cracked 5 years later in Todmorden when he forged pethidine prescriptions to feed his own habit, earning a conviction and nominal fine, before slipping back into practice after a brief detour. By 1977, he had settled in Hyde, first in the Donnybrook Group, and from 1992 in a one-man surgery where no colleague could watch him. Behind closed doors, he injected elderly women with massive doses of diamorphine, recorded, quote, peaceful natural deaths, then comforted grieving relatives who trusted every word he wrote. He falsified notes within minutes of each killing and pressed families to choose cremation, knowing the fire would erase puncture marks and drug traces. Unease finally surfaced in March 1998, when funeral director Deborah Massey and local GP Linda Reynolds counted an alarming cluster of shipment certificates and alerted police. Greater Manchester detectives spent only weeks on a paper check and reported no cause for concern, then closed the file on April 17, 1998. Shipman proceeded to claim 3 more lives in the spring that followed. His last known victim, 81-year-old former mayoress Kathleen Grundy, died on June 24, 1998, after what he described as a routine home visit. Hours later, he produced a will leaving him her £386,000 estate. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, dismissed the signature as a forgery and demanded an exhumation that found lethal morphine delivered within minutes of death. Computer audits showed Shipman had backdated her notes, just as he had for many others. Arrested in early September 1998, he faced a 4-month trial at Preston Crown Court, and on January 31, 2000, a jury convicted him of 15 murders and 1 count of forgery. The judge handed down a whole life order, ensuring he would never leave prison. The public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith later attributed at least 215 deaths to him and said the true toll might have reached 250 or more. Academic reviews that current prescribing data have pushed the estimate nearer to 260. Shipman never admitted a single killing, writing letters to his family while remaining aloof from investigators. In the early hours of January 13, 2004, 1 day shy of his 58th birthday, he took his own life in his Wakefield cell, escaping the questions he had refused to answer. Michael Joseph Swango was born in 1954 in Tacoma, Washington, and grew up in Quincy, Illinois, where classmates noticed his fascination with violent newspaper clippings long before he entered medicine. He served in the Marine Corps after high school, excelled at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, yet fellow students whispered about a trail of sudden patient collapses during his clinical rotations. In July 1984, he started his surgical internship at Ohio State University Hospital. Within weeks, nurses logged unexplained code blues whenever he stepped onto the ward, and one later recalled seeing him push a syringe into a patient's IV moments before the man stopped breathing. Internal reviews cleared him, but deaths kept mounting until the hospital quietly let him go. Back in Quincy, he joined an ambulance crew and brought boxes of pastries to work. Several medics collapsed with crippling cramps, and lab tests pointed to ant poison, arsenic, inside the frosting. Investigators found bottles of toxins in his apartment, and in August 1985, an Illinois court handed him a 5-year sentence for aggravated battery. He served just 2 years. Paroled in 1987, he forged reference letters, regained a medical license, and roamed from Veterans Affairs hospitals in South Dakota to a neurological clinic in New York, choosing frail patients and injecting them with massive doses of insulin that sent blood pressure plummeting. Administrators noticed spikes in cardiac arrests, but each time he resigned before disciplinary hearings could pin him down. In 1994, he disappeared to Zimbabwe under a new contract at Many Mission Hospital. Over the next 8 months, at least 5 healthy villagers died within hours of his injections, and colleagues caught him carrying vials of painkillers that were never prescribed. When authorities closed in, he flew to South Africa, then tried to transit through Chicago O'Hare in June 1997. Federal agents arrested him on fraud charges linked to his forged employment forms. Facing extradition requests from 3 countries, he struck a deal. In September 2000, he pleaded guilty to murdering 3 Long Island patients and to fatally poisoning Ohio State patient Cynthia McGee, accepting 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. Prosecutors introduced notebooks where he ranked lethal drugs and posted about practice making perfect, while FBI analysis estimated his real toll at more than 60 deaths across 2 continents. John Bodkin Adams was born in 1899 in Northern Ireland. After qualifying in Belfast and London, he moved to Eastbourne in 1922 and built a genteel practice that revolved around elderly, well-off widows who found his bedside prayers and small talk reassuring. By the mid-1950s, detectives counted 132 wills in which grateful patients had left him gifts ranging from silverware to a Rolls-Royce, and 163 of those benefactors had slipped into fatal comas while he controlled their morphine charts. Whispered stories about, quote, Dr. Adams' opiates circulated for years, yet he brushed them aside as a charity repaid for diligent care. He wrote huge orders for heroin and morphine that other GPs considered reckless, yet lingered at the bedside to, as he later said, ease the passing. Detective Superintendent Herbert Hannum began probing cremation forms in August 1956, and, during a raid on Adams' surgery, caught him slipping 2 unlocked bottles of morphine into his coat pocket. The inquiry focused on 2 deaths: 81-year-old Edith Morrill, who endured heavy opiates after a stroke, and 50-year-old Gertrude Hullett, who died after an unexplained barbiturate collapse a month after changing her will. Arrested that December, Adams faced the Old Bailey in March 1957. The 17-day hearing became the longest murder trial Britain had seen at the time. The jury acquitted him of Morrill's murder on April 8th, after defense lawyers produced nurses' notebooks that undercut the prosecution's drug calculations, and the Hullett indictment was quietly dropped. 2 weeks later, another jury found him guilty of forging prescriptions, lying on cremation forms, concealing drugs, and failing to keep a dangerous drugs register, and he was struck off the medical roll in 1957. He regained his license in 1961, kept a low profile, and used libel victories, as newspapers kept calling him a killer, together with those legacies, to live comfortably until his death in Eastbourne on July 4, 1983. Researchers who opened police files in 2003 suggested his real toll exceeded 160 patients. Adams never confessed, telling detectives that helping someone die, quote, isn't all that wicked, and claiming it was impossible to accuse a doctor. His gentle voice, ready syringe, and taste for heirlooms turned a seaside resort into a hunting ground. Thomas Neil Cream was born in 1850 in Glasgow and moved with his parents to Quebec City when he was 4. He entered McGill's Medical School in 1872 and graduated in 1876, but whispers followed him at once. A pregnant patient found dead behind his London, Ontario surgery in 1879 with a signature on a letter many believed he forged. Cream crossed the border to Chicago in 1880, opened a practice yards from the brothels, and sold secret abortions along with patient medicines. Over the next year, Mary Faulkner, Alice Montgomery, and others died convulsing after his treatments. Yet the case that stuck concerned 61-year-old Daniel Stott, whose epilepsy pills were laced with strychnine. Coroner later allowed the family to carve "poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream" on Stott's tombstone. In November 1881, Cream drew a life sentence at Joliet Prison, but his brother's lobbying and talk of bribes won him a pardon in July 1891. He sailed straight to London, rented rooms on Lambeth Palace Road, and resumed killing within weeks. Barmaid Ellen Donworth collapsed after drinking from a glass he handed her. Sex worker Matilda Clover died shrieking in her bed, and Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel died side by side after swallowing capsules he promised would soothe their coughs, each dose heavy with strychnine. Between murders, he mailed anonymous letters blaming respectable physicians and demanding cash, a blunder that drew Scotland Yard's attention. Detectives shadowed him as he tried and failed to poison Lou Harvey, noticed his repeated purchases of corrosive acids, and arrested him on June 3, 1892. At the Old Bailey that October, the jury took 12 minutes to convict him of 4 murders and 1 attempted murder, and on November 15, 1892, he was hanged in Newgate Prison. Linda Hazard was born in 1869 in Minnesota, and she left school early, claiming a self-study in osteopathy before a loophole let her call herself doctor when Washington began licensing alternative healers in 1907. In Minneapolis, she practiced fasting therapy, and according to later police files, likely caused her first fatality there in 1902, before abandoning her husband and 2 children. With new husband Samuel Hazard, fresh from prison for bigamy, she sailed west, publishing Fasting for the Cure of Disease in 1908, and opened a remote clinic she called Wilderness Heights in Kitsap County. Locals, watching skeletal figures stagger along the road, renamed the place Starvation Heights. Hazard prescribed 2 cups of thin tomato or asparagus broth a day, hours-long enemas that left buckets of water running pink, and brutal massage sessions that staff heard through cabin walls, Patients surrendered jewelry and signed blank stationery, while she repeated that pain meant impurities were leaving the body. Her earliest Washington casualty, 38-year-old Daisy Maud Hagland, died after a 50-day fast in February 1908, leaving behind a 3-year-old son. Over the next 3 years, lawyers, publishers, and visitors from as far as New Zealand collapsed in her cabins, some found wearing only bed sheets and weighing under 100 pounds. The breaking point came with British sisters Claire and Dorothea Williamson, wealthy spiritualists who arrived in February 1911, seeking the most beautiful treatment. By April, they lay delirious at 35 and 50 pounds. Hazard stored their diamonds in her safe, forged an alteration to Claire's will, and declared cirrhosis killed her when Claire died on June 1st. Dorothea's former nanny found the doctor wearing Claire's silk robe and summoned the British vice consul, who persuaded Kitsap County to file charges after Dorothea paid a $1,000 bill for her release. Hazard was arrested on August 15, 1911, and tried in Port Orchard the following January. Nurses described enemas that ran until the girls fainted, and the jury convicted her of manslaughter in Claire's death on February 7, 1912, sentencing her to 2 to 20 years. She served barely 2 years in Walla Walla, fasting in protest, then won a 1916 pardon on the condition she leave the country. After a stint in New Zealand, she returned in 1920, rebuilt her School of Health, and watched it burn to the ground in 1935. 3 years later, she attempted one last self-prescribed fast and died of starvation on June 24, 1938, aged 70. Still insisting food, and not she, killed her victims. Howard Webster Mudgett, later known as Henry Howard Holmes, was born in 1861 in New Hampshire. He studied anatomy at the University of Michigan where classmates whispered that he stole cadavers for insurance swindles, then drifted west under a new name that sounded less provincial and more trustworthy. In 1886, he arrived in Chicago, charmed a widow out of her Englewood drugstore, and bought the vacant lot across the street. Over the next 6 years, he supervised a 3-story labyrinth, ground floor shops to mask the enterprise, rooms above that stopped at brick dead ends, gas lines threaded behind walls, and a hidden chute that slid straight to the basement furnace. Contractors he refused to pay saw only fragments of the plans. Holmes alone held the master sketch. When the World's Columbian Exposition opened in the spring of 1893, he advertised the building as a hotel. Young clerks, fairgoers, and would-be secretaries checked in, lured by free rent or the promise of work, then vanished behind soundproof doors. Some suffocated in locked chambers fed by gas jets. Others were starved or chloroformed, or strapped to a surgical table so he could strip flesh for skeleton dealers and medical colleges. Ash from the kiln and quicklime pits in the cellar erased the rest. Holmes juggled fraud alongside murder. He seduced Minnie and Nanny Williams out of Texas land deeds worth thousands, signed their names on transfer papers, and killed them both. By 1894, creditors closed in, so he fled with his accomplice Benjamin Pitzel, plotting one last insurance con. Pitzel would fake his death. Holmes would collect the $10,000 payout, and they would split the money. Instead, Holmes knocked Pitzel unconscious in Philadelphia, set him on fire with chloroform, and convinced the insurer the corpse was genuine. To tie off loose ends, he spirited 3 Pitzel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, across the Midwest, moving them between rented rooms while forging letters to their mother. Howard's dismembered remains later turned up in an Indianapolis stove. The girls were found buried beneath a Toronto cellar floor. Pinkerton men tracking train receipts and missing person flyers finally grabbed Holmes in Boston on November 17, 1894. A Philadelphia jury convicted him of only murdering Benjamin Pitzel, but in prison, Holmes coolly confessed to 27 killings. Some victims later proved alive, others never identified. Journalists inflated the tally to 200. Detectives settled on at least 9. He asked that his coffin be filled with cement so no anatomist could dissect him. Then at dawn, on May 7, 1896, he dropped through the gallows floor at Moyamensing Prison, still smiling. Kermit Gosnell, born in 1941 in West Philadelphia, graduated from Jefferson Medical College and opened the Women's Medical Society on Lancaster Avenue, advertising low-cost abortions to poor women long after the legal cutoff for viability. Over the years, he trimmed overhead by hiring unlicensed staff, reusing disposable instruments, and leaving the night shift to teenagers while he slept upstairs. Cockroaches scuttled across blood-stained floors, cats wandered through the procedure rooms, and shelves filled with cloudy jars held severed fetal feet as grotesque trophies. Even routine paperwork was faked, gestational ages altered with the swipe of an ultrasound probe, blank prescription pads left out for cash customers who wanted OxyContin or Xanax. On November 19, 2009, 41-year-old refugee Kamamaya Munga stopped breathing after staff pumped her full of Demerol and left her unattended. Gosnell arrived only after paramedics were already performing CPR. Complaints piled up, but regulators looked away until federal drug agents planned a pill mill raid in February 2010. Detectives pushed through the rear door and hit a stench so thick their eyes watered. They found refrigerators packed with bagged remains and a cabinet stuffed with 47 bodies dating back years. Freezers were jammed because Gosnell had stopped paying the medical waste company. A grand jury called the place a house of horrors. In January 2011, Gosnell, his wife, and 8 employees were arrested. At the trial in May 2013, jurors heard how Gosnell induced labor, waited for the infants to breathe, then snipped their spinal cords with scissors. He was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, the involuntary manslaughter of Munga, 21 illegal late-term abortions, and 211 consent violations. He waived his appeal to avoid the death penalty and received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 30 years for running the drug mill. Walter Basson, born in 1950 and trained as a cardiologist, became the personal physician to apartheid leader P.W. Botha, and in 1981 slipped into a far darker role. He was put in charge of Project Coast, a clandestine chemical and biological weapons program bankrolled by the South African Defence Force. Working through a web of front companies, he recruited hundreds of scientists and drew an annual budget in the tens of millions, earning the press label Dr. Death. Inside the program, Basson pushed for weapons that killed without a trace, and for agents that quietly broke communities from within. Researchers brewed anthrax, cholera, and a nerve agent blend of ketamine, succinylcholine, and tuberculin that would become known as the triple cocktail, later used to sedate at least 200 prisoners before they were dumped from aircraft into the Atlantic. Lab notebooks described poisoned cigarettes, chocolate laced with thallium, and even a covert contraceptive designed to sterilize black populations. Ecstasy and Mandrax tablets were stockpiled by the ton, allegedly to see drug epidemics in anti-apartheid strongholds. Some victims' remains were dissolved in acid to erase evidence. When the new government ordered the program shut down, Basson kept documents and drugs. He was arrested in a 1997 sting while handing over a trash bag packed with more than 1,000 ecstasy tablets, then faced 67 charges, including 229 murders, at a marathon trial that began in 1999. The judge dismissed many counts and, in April 2002, acquitted him of the rest. A decade later, the Health Professions Council found him guilty of unethical conduct, yet a string of appeals stalled sentencing. As of June 2025, he is still fighting the regulator in court, while performing heart surgery in Cape Town. Radan Kravic was born in 1945 in Montenegro and studied psychiatry in Sarajevo and polished his resume with a brief fellowship at Columbia before returning to treat anxiety in the city's biggest hospital. Politics pulled him off the ward. He co-founded the Serb Democratic Party, and by April 1992, he sat in the presidential chair of the breakaway Republika Srpska. From there, he authorized concentric artillery rings around Sarajevo. Shells and sniper rounds raked the capital for 44 months, killing more than 10,000 civilians as food and water ran out. In July 1995, his troops overran the UN-protected enclave of Srebrenica and executed roughly 8,000 of them in farmyards and warehouses before bulldozing their bodies into mass graves. Columns of refugees staggered from burned villages, while detainees vanished into camps where beatings and rape were routine. Indicted for genocide that same year, Karadzic disappeared for 13 years, growing a white beard and rebranding himself as Dr. Dragan David Dabic, an alternative medicine guru who lectured on quantum energy in Belgrade health fairs, until Serbian agents hauled him off a bus in July 2008. At The Hague, he faced 11 counts. Judges convicted him in 2016, and an appeals panel in 2019 swapped his 40-year term for life. Ikuo Hayashi had once been a star cardiologist, KO trained, head of circulatory medicine at a national sanatorium, and a published researcher. In 1990, he resigned, left his family, and entered Aum Shinrikyo's monastic ranks. Shoko Asahara made him, quote, Minister of Healing, a title that soon covered electroshock interrogation, sodium pentothal injections, and at least one drug-induced kidnapping that ended in a fatal overdose. When Asahara ordered a preemptive strike against an impending police raid, Hayashi drew the Chiyoda Line assignment. At dawn on March 20, 1995, he and getaway driver Tomomitsu Nimi wrapped 2 plastic bags of liquid sarin in communist and Buddhist newspapers, then boarded the 748 southwest-bound train in the first car. Near Shin Ochanomizu, he jabbed one bag with a sharpened umbrella tip, stepped onto the platform, and walked away while the nerve agent hissed through the rush-hour air. 2 station employees died trying to clear the leaking bundle. 231 commuters suffered convulsions, blindness, or respiratory failure before the train was finally halted at Kasumi Gaseki. Hayashi surrendered to police a month later, turned over lab notes, and testified against senior cultists. His cooperation spared him the death penalty. On May 26, 1998, the Tokyo District Court handed down life imprisonment with a 20-year minimum, a sentence that is still held in 2025. Eugene L. Sanger, a Harvard-trained radiologist born in 1917, built his career at the University of Cincinnati, where the Pentagon quietly hired him in 1960 to learn what nuclear battlefields might do to human flesh. Over the next 11 years, He wheeled at least 88 advanced cancer patients, most of them poor and about 60% black, into a Cobalt 60 machine and hit them with up to 25 to 300 rads in an hour, the energy equivalent of roughly 20,000 chest x-rays. Nurses recorded waves of vomiting, searing abdominal pain, hallucinations, and violent chills as blood pressures crashed behind the lead-lined doors. 21 subjects died within a month. 3/4 were gone by the end of the first year. None had been told that the Defense Department paid for the study, and during the early runs, Sagan skipped written consents altogether, relying on oral go-aheads that families later said never happened. He published the work as Therapy, won a gold medal from his professional society, and shut the project only after Senator Edward Kennedy's committee threatened hearings in 1972. Public attention resurfaced in the 1990s, relatives filed a class action suit, and in 1999, the university and the federal government paid a $3.6 million settlement while Sanger, then in retirement, insisted the radiation had offered palliation. He died in 2007 at 90 years old, his name engraved on both radiology textbooks and a court docket that read like a Cold War autopsy report. Ayman al-Zawahiri grew up in a household of surgeons and pharmacists and qualified in medicine at Cairo University in 1974. After a stint as an army doctor, he ran a clinic in the suburb of Mahdi, but evenings found him drilling a clandestine Islamist cell that worshipped Sayyid Qutb's writing more than any medical test. Egyptian police swept him up after Anwar Sadat's 1981 assassination. 18 months in Tora prison hardened his views, and by 1985, he had slipped to the Afghan frontier, treating Mujahideen wounds while recruiting for what became Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a group he later led. In February 1998, Zawahiri folded that organization into Osama bin Laden's network and co-signed a fatwa urging Muslims to kill Americans, quote, wherever they could find them. 5 months later, twin truck bombs tore apart the US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, leaving 224 dead and shards of glass embedded in bodies pulled from the street. Prosecutors later set him alongside Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in planning the hijackings of 9/11. When a SEAL team killed bin Laden in 2011, Zawahiri became emir and sent video sermons from the Pakistani hills, blessing branch offices from Yemen to West Africa. His run ended just after dawn on July 31, 2022, when 2 Hellfire R9X missiles, each packed with wiring blades, rather than explosives, punched through the balcony of a Kabul safe house and sliced him apart without waking the neighbors. He was 71. Karl Brandt grew up in the German Empire's dying days and earned his medical degree just as the Nazis rose to power. He impressed Adolf Hitler by saving a friend injured in a 1932 car crash, and that single act pushed him inside the regime's inner circle. By 1934, he wore an SS uniform and carried the title Personal Physician to the Führer, a rank that let him bypass normal medical ethics at will. In 1939, Hitler signed a backdated memo placing Brandt, along with Philip Bohler, in charge of a secret euthanasia program, later codenamed Action T4. Under Brandt's signature, grey buses collected thousands of disabled children and adults from hospitals and asylums. They were driven to converted clinics where carbon monoxide chambers, disguised as showers, suffocated them. Autopsy tables sat nearby so staff could harvest organs for so-called research before burning the bodies in an on-site crematoria. Within 2 years, about 70,000 people had been killed, and the killing methods refined there for industrial murder in the camps. Even after T4 was forced underground, Brandt's authority only widened. As Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, he approved experiments that froze prisoners in ice water, shattered bones to test surgical techniques, and injected typhus into healthy men and women. He routinely signed letters relegating asocial inmates to gas vans under Action 14F13, a quiet extension of T4 inside concentration camps. Captured by American troops in 1945, Brandt faced the dock at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. The judges linked his elegant signature to thousands of death certificates and condemned him for mass murder and torture carried out under the guise of medicine. He was hanged on June 2, 1948. Karl Klauberg built his reputation in the 1930s as a fertility specialist at the University of Königsberg, publishing papers on hormone therapy that caught the attention of Heinrich Himmler. The SS wanted a quick, cheap way to sterilize those they labeled as undesirable, and Klauberg promised he could deliver it without surgery. By late 1941, he wore the SS uniform and rank, and had access to Block 10 inside Auschwitz, a brick barrack sealed off from the rest of the camp. There, he selected Jewish and Roma women and bound them to gynecological chairs. He injected a liquid mixture of formalin, iodine, and silver nitrate directly into the cervix, then clamped it shut. The caustic solution burned fallopian tubes into scar tissue, often leaving the patients feverish, bleeding, and screaming from pelvic cramps. Klauberg ordered x-rays that showed fallopian tubes swollen like balloons. He photographed the women nude, cataloguing each stage of damage. Records indicated that at least 700 subjects endured the procedure. Dozens died from sepsis, and many survivors remained infertile and incontinent for life. Klauberg bragged to Himmler that he could sterilize 1,000 women in a single day if given enough supplies. When the Red Army advanced in 1944, he transferred to Ravensbrück and repeated the injections there. Soviet forces arrested him in 1945, and a Moscow tribunal sentenced him to 25 years, but he was released during a prisoner exchange a decade later. West German police rearrested him in 1955 on multiple counts of grievous bodily harm and murder. He collapsed from heart failure in his cell at Kiel on August 9, 1957, before a German court could hear the full extent of his experiments. Herta Oberhauser grew up near Cologne and earned her medical degree just as the Third Reich began rewarding fierce loyalty in white coats. By 1937, she had joined the Nazi Party and volunteered for the SS. Karl Gebhardt posted her to Ravensbrück, a women's camp he treated like a private laboratory. Oberhauser selected young prisoners, mostly Polish political inmates, and carved deep slits into their lower legs. She packed the wounds with dirt, ground glass, and virulent streptococcus, stitched them shut without anesthesia, then sat back to watch the tissue rot. When gangrene set in, she reopened the limbs, sliced away muscle, and photographed the damage to prove sulfonamide drugs failed unless the flesh was first contaminated. Some patients died of septic shock. Others lost limbs she amputated in late-night surgeries. She used the same operating table to inject healthy children with oil mixed with barbiturates, killing them within minutes, so she could dissect their glands for research. After the war, the Allies found her notebooks filled with neat sketches of mutilated legs. At the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, she was the only woman in the dock and received a 20-year sentence on August 20, 1947. As the political wing shifted, she walked free in 1952 and quietly opened a pediatric clinic in northern Germany until outraged survivors exposed her past. Medical authorities finally struck her off the rolls in 1958. She lived under her married name, Herta Schodenschak, until she died in 1978. Sigmund Russia entered medical school in Munich during the late Weimar years and backed the rising Nazi party as soon as it looked powerful. His career leapt forward after he married the much older Caroline Dial, who boasted a friendship with Heinrich Himmler. In 1939, the SS transferred Russia to the Luftwaffe's Institute for Aviation Medicine, then gave him Block 5 at Dachau as a live lab. Beginning in February 1942, he sealed prisoners inside a low-pressure chamber and pumped out the air to simulate altitudes above 68,000 feet. Many convulsed, bled from the ears and eyes, and died while Russia's team recorded every spasm on film. Corpses were dissected minutes later to see if bubbles or burnt vessels matched his barometric readings. When the Luftwaffe asked about rescue methods for downed pilots, he switched to hypothermia studies. Inmates were stripped naked, plunged into vats of ice, or left on open platforms during winter nights. He tracked their falling body temperatures with rectal probes, then tested rewarming techniques that included scalding baths and, on Himmler's suggestion, forced sex with camp nurses while the victims still shook from cold. He also shot prisoners in the limbs to test a blood-clotting powder he called Polygal, opening up the wounds afterwards to gauge internal bleeding. At least 300 men and women died directly from his procedures. Russia's fortunes turned when SS investigators discovered he and Caroline had faked pregnancies by kidnapping newborns to impress Himmler with supposed fertility research. Himmler ordered his arrest. On April 26, 1945, with American forces only miles away, SS guards marched Russia to the yard behind Dachau's crematorium. and executed him with a single pistol shot. Aribert Heine grew up in Baden, studied medicine at the universities of Graz and Vienna, and joined the Waffen-SS as soon as Austria's annexation opened the door. In October 1941, he arrived at Mauthausen as camp doctor and turned the infirmary into a killing theatre. Prisoners recalled him marking the healthiest inmates for surgery practice, then strapping them to an operating table without anesthesia. Heine cut out kidneys and livers while the men remained conscious, noted the exact time pain turned to shock, and finally ended the sessions by injecting gasoline, phenol, or air directly into the heart. He preserved severed heads in formaldehyde as classroom props and logged each death with meticulous timings in his notebook. Survivors estimated he killed roughly 200 people during his 11 weeks at the camp. Heine rotated briefly through Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen before the war collapsed. US forces arrested him in 1945 but released him 2 years later. Unaware of his record, he opened a gynecology practice in Baden-Baden, kept trophies in a basement safe, and attended ice hockey matches under the nickname Dr. Death. West German prosecutors finally issued a warrant in 1962. Heine fled the same night, leaving behind journals that described the heart injections in clinical detail. He lived for decades as Tarek Hussein Farid in Cairo, converted to Islam, and earned money from Austrian real estate investments. Cancer caught up with him in August 1992, and he died under an assumed name in a shabby hospital room. His death went unconfirmed until 2009, when reporters recovered the autopsy file and his patient card. Horst Schumann was born in Halle in 1906 and studied medicine at Leipzig and joined the Nazi Party long before graduation. By 1940, he directed gassing operations at Grafeneck and Sonnenstein under Action T4, work that convinced Heinrich Himmler he could sterilize entire populations on an assembly line schedule. In July 1942, Schumann reached Auschwitz with a bank of Siemens X-ray tubes and claimed 2 isolation blocks as his clinic. Jewish and Roma prisoners stood naked behind a lead screen while he blasted their pelvis with high-dose radiation. Skin bubbled and peeled within hours, ovaries and testicles shrank or calcified over weeks. Schumann tracked each change with crude calipers, then cut out glands without anesthesia to confirm the dose. Patients left the table burned, incontinent, and often septic. Those too weak for follow-up were sent straight to the gas chambers. Camp ledgers suggested he sterilized well over 1,000 people, with only a handful surviving. US forces never linked him to the experiments, and after brief internment, he opened a sports medicine practice in Gladbeck. When West German prosecutors issued a warrant in 1951, he slipped into Egypt and later settled in Ghana under a forged passport and treating government officials for cash. Ghanaian police arrested him in 1966 and extradited him to Frankfurt, but his trial collapsed 4 years later when doctors declared him unfit to stand trial. He spent the rest of his life in a Bavarian nursing home and died on May 5, 1983, without a verdict against his name. Edward Worths left a Bavarian farm for a medical school at Würzburg, took his degree in 1933, and joined the SS the following year. After a bout of typhus on the Eastern Front, he embraced desk-side medicine and in October 1942 became Standortarzt, the chief garrison physician at Auschwitz. The title puts him on the ramp that greeted every arriving transport. A flick of his riding crop sent one line to forced labor, and the other straight to the gas chambers, consigning hundreds of thousands to the ovens with a gesture. Worths called his personal project cervical cancer research. In the women's camp, he strapped prisoners to plywood tables, rammed biopsy punches through the cervix without anesthetic, and excised chunks of tissue until blood pooled on the floor, then shoved soiled gauze into the wounds before dragging the women back to the barracks, already thick with typhus and dysentery. Many died of septic shock, others were called in follow-up autopsies that doubled as lessons for SS trainees. Worth signed penal requisitions for heart injections, approved Mengeler's twin studies, and oversaw ramp selections until the last evacuation in January 1945. British troops caught him near Hyde that September, faced with interrogation notes tying his signature to the Auschwitz death books. Worth took his own life in his cell on September 20, 1945, 3 days after capture. There's probably no better way to start the final tier of the evil doctor's iceberg by talking about the man who most people probably consider to be the evil doctor. SS officer Dr. Joseph Mengele was the most notorious physician at Auschwitz, infamous for orchestrating inhumane and often deadly medical experiments on prisoners. Nicknamed the Angel of Death for his role in the camp, he is remembered for standing on the arrival ramp and calmly selecting who would live and who would be sent immediately to their death. In 1943, armed with doctorates in medicine and anthropology, Mengele arrived at Auschwitz and saw it as an opportunity to conduct ambitious human experiments with an endless supply of victims. Mengele had a particular fascination with twins. He would stand on the unloading ramp eagerly scanning for twins, often young siblings, among the incoming prisoners. Around 3,000 twins in total were taken as his test subjects, most of them children, and only about 200 of those individuals survived. These twins were housed separately and subjected to near-daily examinations and procedures. Mengele's team meticulously measured every aspect of their bodies, drew large quantities of blood, and performed various medical experiments that inflicted great pain, often with no anesthesia at all. Driven with a twisted curiosity about heredity, Mengele carried out disturbing experiments on his twin subjects with cold, clinical detachment. He injected dyes and other chemicals into children's eyes in an effort to change their eye color, and deliberately infected one twin with diseases like typhus, before transfusing that twin's blood into the other to compare their reactions. He performed major surgeries and even amputations without anesthesia, showing no regard for the agony it caused. Often, once an experiment was complete, Mengele would order the twins to be killed with a lethal injection so he could dissect their bodies and examine them post-mortem. Mengele's research extended beyond twins. During selections, he also singled out anyone with unusual physical features, such as dwarfs, giants, or people with deformities, to become his subjects. These individuals were measured, photographed, and studied, and then after a short period, they were usually killed, and their remains, such as skeletons or organs, sent off to researchers in Germany for further study. He had a special interest in heterochromia and would kill prisoners with that condition and send their eyes to his former professor's institute for examination. All of these experiments were guided by the Nazi racial ideology. Mengele used pseudoscience to prove the supposed inferiority of Jews and Roma. He also hoped to uncover genetic secrets that could benefit the Aryan population. For example, studying twins to learn how to increase the chance of multiple births among Germans. In reality, his work was only cruelty masked as science. Most of his victims were children, and many of those subjected to his procedures died from the experiments or were murdered once he had no further use for them. Mengele carried out each of these acts with a calm clinical detachment, but the scale of suffering was immense. By the time he fled Auschwitz in early 1945, thousands of men, women, and children had been killed in his laboratories. After Germany's defeat, he managed to escape Europe and live under false identities. He spent years in South America, evading all attempts to bring him to justice. Joseph Mengele ultimately had a stroke and drowned in Brazil in 1979, never having faced trial for his crimes at Auschwitz. Shiro Ishii was the architect of Japan's notorious Unit 731, a medical officer turned war criminal who built a covert bioweapons program under the guise of an epidemic prevention unit. In 1936, he established a sprawling compound in occupied Manchuria where science was twisted into torture. Ishii, a microbiologist by trade, led experiments that defy imagination. Prisoners were dehumanized as logs and used in live dissections, deliberate infection trials, poison gas tests, and even bubonic plague bomb attacks on Chinese cities. He boasted of developing germ weapons for the Imperial Army, work so valued that Emperor Hirohito awarded him a special medal. Under Ishii's command, more than 10,000 people died in Unit 731's human experiments, which spared no one. Men, women, and even children, including infants, were infected, mutilated, or frozen to death in the name of research. As defeat loomed in 1945, Ishii ordered the slaughter of all remaining prisoners to destroy evidence, leaving no survivors to tell the tale. Masashi Kitano succeeded Ishii as Unit 731's commander in 1945, ensuring that atrocities only escalated. A doctor and army lieutenant general, Kitano oversaw the mass production of deadly pathogens and continued the gruesome human experimentation program. During his tenure, he led large-scale biological warfare research and sped up the manufacturing of germ weapons, brewing vast quantities of plague, anthrax, cholera, and more for use on the battlefield. Victims were injected with lethal bacteria or vivisected like lab animals in pursuit of data. In secret wartime reports, Gitano cynically wrote that experiments were done on monkeys, but in truth they were done on humans, a fact he later confessed to American interrogators after the war. Even as he co-authored papers on epidemic prevention, he was fully complicit in the torture and murder of living subjects. Gitano's own post-war confession detailed how Unit 731, under his command, had become an assembly line of death, turning medical science into an instrument of cruelty. Hisato Yoshimura was Unit 731's chief physiologist, notorious for his obsession with hypothermia and frostbite experiments. Before the war, he was a lecturer at Kyoto's medical school, but in Manchuria, he turned his knowledge to inhumane ends. Yoshimura's prisoners were forced to endure prolonged freezing of their limbs. He made men, and sometimes women and children, submerge arms and legs in ice water until they froze solid. An eyewitness recalled that when guards struck a victim's froze limb with a stick, it sounded like wood against the ice in their flesh. Yoshimura then experimented with the thawing of living subjects, dousing the frostbitten appendages in hot water, holding them near open flames, or simply leaving victims overnight to see how long their thawing took. Many suffered agonizing pain, gangrene, and death, as he meticulously recorded the effects. These gruesome trials were ostensibly how to learn how to treat frostbite for Japanese troops, but they came at the expense of innocent lives. Chillingly, Yoshimura was never punished. After the war, he obtained immunity and even continued his academic career in Japan. Ryoichi Naito was another Unit 731 scientist who played a key role in Japan's germ warfare program. A microbiologist and Army Lieutenant Colonel, Naito ran a branch of Unit 731 in Singapore during the early 1940s. There, under the cover of preventing disease among Japanese troops, he built a secret biological weapons factory. Naito's operation cultivated some of the deadliest pathogens known: bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, typhus, anthrax, mass-produced as weapons. Tens of thousands of live rats were bred or trapped so they could be infected with plague bacteria, then fed to fleas. These plague-infested fleas were intended to be released as living bombs to spread disease pandemics in enemy territories. In China, Unit 731 had already tested this technique by dumping plague-infected fleas over villages, causing lethal outbreaks. Naito expanded such efforts to Southeast Asia, supervising about 150 medical staff in covert germ warfare projects. As Allied forces closed in, he destroyed his lab and fled, but like many of his colleagues, he escaped justice. After the war, the US granted him immunity in exchange for his research. Naito went on to co-found Japan's first blood bank in 1950, a startling second act for a man who had bred plague and anthrax for the war. Finally, there is Yoshio Shinozuka, a low-ranking Unit 731 member who provides a harrowing glimpse from the bottom of the hierarchy. Shinozuka was only a teenager when he was recruited as an army medic and assigned to Unit 731, initially under the impression that he'd been helping provide clean water to troops. Instead, he was drawn into the unit's blood-soaked work. His daily duties included raising plague-carrying fleas on infected rats and assisting in vivisections, the dissection of the live human prisoners. Shinozuka later testified in grim detail about what he had done. He described participating in at least 5 live dissections of Chinese captives. His job was to restrain and prep the victims. He would hose down naked prisoners, scrubbing them clean, and then carry them to the operating table, where army surgeons waited. With the subjects still fully conscious, the surgeons checked that their hearts were beating, and then cut them open with scalpels, performing fatal organ removals and observations without any anesthetic. The Unit 731 staff euphemistically called their victims logs, even reporting killings as though they were chopping wood. Shinozuka recalled the cruelty of it vividly in later years, haunted by how, quote, "our unit did things no human being should ever do." His conscience drove him to become one of the few Japanese veterans to publicly apologize for Unit 731's crimes, recounting how prisoners were treated as less than human and cruelly murdered in the name of science. His words underscored the darkest truth of Unit 731, that these doctors, sworn to heal, turned medicine into a weapon of nightmarish brutality. And that's the end of the video, folks. It was definitely interesting to actually make an iceberg of my own, and it's certainly something I want to try again soon. But the next one will be one that I found that I think is interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye. Also, thanks again to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Click the link to get 83% off for just $2 a month, as well as 4 months completely free.